This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Go to our website at wdtatpodcast.com and click on support to learn how you can be part of this effort to learn how to have better conversations, increase compassion, and build bridges, not walls. You can make a one-time donation or become a patron for as little as $1 a month and receive patron-only benefits. This week, I want to thank Stephen Swanson and Joe Bumbulis for becoming patrons and supporting the podcast. Thanks, Joe, and thanks, Steve. And now, let's get into it. In this episode, I talked to Michael Evans about empathy, what it is and how it works. We also talk about our feelings and why dads are the most emotional, and we develop our new brand, the Baptist Buddha. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
My guest today is Michael Evans, a podcaster with Empathy and Podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Thank you for having me, Lucas. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about empathy with you. It's something that's come up a lot on this podcast. I think I've recommended this animated video of a Brené Brown talk about the difference between sympathy and empathy. I feel like I've recommended it at least a couple times. And it's definitely something that I think connects with this idea of how do we have hard conversations, and empathy, probably has to be part of that. And so I was really excited to find your podcast and connect with you, and excited to talk to you today about empathy.
Yeah.
Before we get into that, tell me a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What do you do?
Sure. Well, yeah. And again, thank you for having me. I love this part of being a podcaster because you start to hear from other people's perspectives and kind of, you can talk about your thing, but kind of couch it in terms that other audiences might find interesting. So again, I really appreciate the invite. So yeah, my name is Michael Evans. I guess, like you said, for lack of a better kind of title for myself, I'm a podcaster by way of former minister. I was a bivocational minister for the better part of 20 years, which mainly just meant I obviously never completely needed the church's money in order to make a living. I've been a project manager with Dell here in Central Texas in Round Rock for almost 15 years now. So that's been really what has put food on my table for the most part. And it's been an interesting ride because I never thought that I would be kind of in the technical industry, and have found myself there and have flourished really for the better part of 15 years. But yeah, I got here by way of, I went to Baylor University, and as well as you did, and went to Truett Seminary there. And from a vocational standpoint, I thought that was going to be me. I thought that was going to be kind of my end goal, was church ministry. And I mean, it served a good purpose for me at the time. I'm a very different person now than I was then, and that's fine.
Aren't we all?
Right, exactly. It's funny what family and having kids and, kind of getting a little bit of gray in your hair might do for how you approach people and how you approach life. So, I mean, as far as, again, like my vocation is kind of this as a program manager, but my passion really is this conversation around empathy, and part of the reason why I started the podcast.
Yeah. So tell me, what was it? Was there something that happened, or what was the journey to really like connecting with this idea of empathy and feeling like it's so important? What was your journey that kind of led you there?
Oh man, I mean, it's probably it's a journey that has taken a lot of roads and kind of converged into this one spot from where I am right now. I mean, I grew up in the church, had a great time in the church. I am not one of those people that would say that the church scarred me at all, really, at least not in my childhood. Had a great family environment growing up, a mom and dad that loved and supported me in whatever I wanted to do. We all moved to Texas from Southern California because of my mom's health. My mom's no longer with us. And I will say that, losing a parent I understand that there's a lot of children out there that lose parents at really young ages. I lost mine, when I was, 22, 23 years old. And that still, that felt like still a very formative time in my life when I would have used my mother's wisdom. And I feel like I still do. She just doesn't happen to be around to dole it out. But, so, through making the commitment to go to seminary and thinking that ministry was where I was headed, and again, having a pretty decent history and pretty decent experience within the church until it kind of wasn't, to be honest. Because I never want to paint it like it was all bad, because much of it was really good. And I'm getting to why empathy is so important, because I got married and then divorced and had the unfortunate experience of not getting much empathy from other people or pastoral care, even for somebody who was on staff. It seemed like a challenge for people to sit in my discomfort with me and in my anguish. And like you talked about that video that Brene Brown, it's the animation that somebody did on top of Brene Brown's TED Talk. And part of the challenge and the absolute anguish, but the joy of experiencing somebody's emotions with them, it's so hard. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people ran away from me and ran away from that when it kind of when it offered itself as an opportunity. And I don't say that to kind of do the whole poor me kind of spiel, but it did kind of spark something in me, because unfortunately I didn't feel like something that I expected from my friends and family within the church. It wasn't there. And so I started wondering kind of the whys and what causes us to approach people and allow for people to be in anguish, and to kind of allow for those emotions to be shared without shying away from it. So I started looking at this idea of empathy as kind of an energy. And I know this could quickly get to sound very woo-woo. And
we're okay with woo-woo. We're okay with whatever. Yeah, it's fine.
So, well, it's funny because when I started thinking about this, it was crazy, because I kind of had this bad experience after getting divorced, and then I kind of powered through it and kept on with the church and ended up being worship and arts pastor at another church here, kind of close in town, and had another bad experience there, where I was kind of pushed out from. And Baptist life is so funny. It's the whole committee on committees and all that kind of jazz, and just kind of rubbed some folks the wrong way that were trustees, and they took it upon themselves outside of the pastoral leadership team to kind of let me go. But anyway,
yeah.
But the reason why I bring that up is because through all those, I kind of powered through it. Because in my mind, the work of the Spirit, the work of love and creation that God continuously kind of enfolds us in is still there, even if I'm not within, the four church walls. And so when I started thinking about that, I was thinking, well, it is the work of the people, which is the literal definition of liturgy. It is the way that we do life together, which can sound so cliche, but when you start talking about the energy of empathy and working with each other and allowing as a corporate group, whether it be a church or a family, to come together in the Spirit, that to me is empathy. And so I started kind of looking at life through this lens to say, everything is an opportunity to collaborate. Everything that you approach is an opportunity to move forward in love. And therefore, kind of everything is touched by this concept of empathy. And so that kind of sent me down the spiral of studying empathy through science and through spirit and through the arts. And I absolutely love it. It constantly surprises me. People constantly surprise me. And it's the most lovely thing.
Yeah. Well, what is something about empathy, maybe to get down to real like brass tacks of what is it and how do we learn about it? What are things that people maybe think empathy is that they're wrong about, or what is it that we don't understand about empathy maybe that we need to understand?
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple things. One is that while we may look at our actions and our attitude as being empathetic or not being empathetic, empathy is not something that we just do. For example, there are scientific studies within the social networks of monkeys, for example, and we notice this within many of our mammal cousins, that they have this concept of familial ties that kind of turn into kind of notions of tribe. You don't see other species within the animal kingdom cry or sing. You do see that within certain, especially the groups of like monkeys. And so from an evolutionary standpoint, what we kind of notice is that there is a part of our brain that is not just similar, but is the same as, it's the limbic part of our brain that we share with our mammalian cousins. And it's this idea of connection. It's this idea of emotions. I mean, anybody that has seen like pictures of people that are going through particular emotions notice that their facial cues are kind of the same across the globe. It doesn't matter where you are, what religion you are, what race you are, what tribe you belong to. When somebody's in pain, they make the same, and they have the same feelings, and they make these same expressions. And you see that within the animal kingdom as well. And so from the science part of it is what is really drew me into it, because I do call it, it's an instinct, and it's inherent in all of us. Now, in some folks, we diminish it because we're told not to convey emotion, but it's still there. And all it takes is a nanosecond of recognition from one person to another to notice something and to know exactly what they're thinking. I think that there's this notion that when you really dive into that too much, that you become enmeshed and you don't want to muddy your feelings or emotions with somebody else. But that's when you go through that instinct and get on the other side and start talking about this idea of cognitive empathy, is when we realize, okay, hold on, this is the same emotion, but it's not the same feeling. Because feelings are a construct of our experiences with that emotion. Feelings kind of pull up memories of how we've experienced and how we've dealt with those emotions before. So while I might have the same emotion as you, the feelings could be wildly different. And that's where we take our cues to be curious, ask questions, listen to people's stories, and really understand what it means to be, in their shoes or looking through their eyes. And so I guess, to answer your question, I think the idea, most people say, well, empathy, it's not something that I do, because they make a choice of who to be empathetic with. And my challenge to that is it just happens. And if you follow that thread and follow that curiosity, you will find more information and more a wealth of knowledge about people if we just follow that line rather than ignoring it.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I definitely don't know as much about the science, but I was thinking of all of this, what I do know, what very little I know about mirror neurons and the way, how babies, why they smile or make faces at us when we make faces at them, and how we're kind of born with these neurons that cause us to mirror other people. When you were talking about how empathy is kind of something that's intrinsic in us, that it's an instinct that we have. And so that makes me think, well, cool, we all have it, we can all do it, but then it seems like we are experiencing a lot of lack of empathy, right? That we don't. So maybe two things. One, like, what is it that's causing us in some ways to unlearn something that we actually have naturally, where we empathize with other people? What are some of those things that seem to diminish that as we grow and learn, like you said, not to express our emotions, for example? And then the flip side of that is there anything we can do to build it up and help work that muscle a little bit? Yeah.
So the first one, it's so tenuous, and I don't pretend to make this sound easy. It's tough because being with people and being vulnerable. I mean, as like Brene Brown talks a lot about vulnerability and shame. And when you start talking about being completely vulnerable in front of somebody, it's absolutely horrifying, because we have a need for belonging. And I would say, and I think Brene would probably agree, that is wired in. And if we notice from birth, and I know there's a little bit of difference here because we're kind of talking about different types of attachments, but I think it's all related. So, I mean, from birth, we have this connection to our mothers. We have this need for not just resources, but also love in order to survive. And I think that's the key. When you start talking about like this idea of survival of the fittest, or survival in general, is that I think we've lost a lot of empathy because we let the fear part of our survival instinct drive the bus. I think Liz Gilbert talks a lot about this as well. We let that part drive the bus rather than the connection. So you have these two options basically when you engage with anybody. You can you can lean in with curiosity and look for connection, or you can look for any opportunity to distinguish yourself from them, and therefore you're kind of making an other category, and you separate yourself. And study upon study upon study has been done on empathy, and in fact they did one on fans of football teams, and European football for that matter, not American football.
Yeah.
They did this study where if you're a fan of a team opposite mine, I'm less likely to show empathy and compassion to you. And we're talking about fans of a sports team here. And so when you blow that up by 1,000 and start talking about the tribal notion and the way that we kind of coalesce around principles and ideals and missions, the instinct, because we want to be safe within our own tribe, can often turn ourselves away from others in order to stay insular and find that safety within our own tribe. And so it's crazy, because of course that's how we're built. And of course that's a good thing. Back when, it was tribe against tribe and your life was literally on the line, you needed those connections in order to stay safe and to stay alive.
Right.
But when we've advanced beyond that type of tribal notion, it's not saying that we all have, or that there aren't parts of the world that still kind of exist within this very tribal nature, because there are. But let's just talk about like American online social identities. When we move beyond this idea that my life is actually in danger here, but we still react with such venom and vitriol and polarizing kind of people into these other groups because that's where we feel more safe. It's a cause of division. It's the ultimate cause of division in my mind. And the best way to answer the second part of your question, the best way to combat that is, this is when I do lean back in my spiritual upbringing and to say, we are all children of God. We are all made in the image of God. And when you find that commonality and allow yourself to be curious about other people and their experiences, you start to lay down your arms. You start to lay down all the venom and realize that we have more that connects us than divides us. A lot of these divisions are these walls that we've constructed on our own, and have really no real bearing to how we interact with each other as humans. So that's my very long elevator pitch on.
No, that's great. And one of the things I noticed as you were, talking about that and how when fear is driving the bus, one thing I noticed in the way that you were describing some of those differences in responses is there still is a drive for connection kind of at the root or at the base of the behaviors or things that are happening. So like maybe with football hooligans, they want connection and belonging to the group that they're a part of. And part of having that connection and belonging means hating the other group. Right. But it's still connection, that good value or that good thing that's at the root of it. It just is maybe missing some of the good pieces, right? Can you find connection? And it's that, vulnerability and shame that you were mentioning, that drive us to say, well, I have to have somebody to be against, because there's fear that if I don't, I could be exposed, or I could be, like it sort of deflects a lot from ourselves. And so then we don't have to we can have someone that we're not going to have empathy for because they're on the out group. We probably have some empathy for the in group that we're a part of, but not for those people, whoever those people are. But to me, it was very interesting to think and remember that connection is still the core of those behaviors. And we were talking before we started recording about episode that I did on nonviolent communication. And I feel like I repeat myself sometimes, but I also think it's because I'm still learning it, and I'm still trying to really learn how to live the truth of those things. And nonviolent communication is that behind every behavior is an unmet need, right?
Yes.
So that need for connection, you can see that behind some behavior that's maybe not so great.
Right.
And that it's another thing about nonviolent communication that I think helps us with this practice of empathy, being able to get over that wall that you're talking about, to be able to see something more human and more common between us, even if I don't agree. Well, I have the same kind of needs that you do. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the most interesting part of this journey is, I started thinking of it, about this around 2016, and something happened that year within American politics that seemed to kind of erupt. So I did that. So I started thinking about this, thinking, all we need is those people get more empathy. Well, I'm not practicing what I preach. Am I?
Yeah,
exactly.
Right. Yeah,
exactly. And so what I've found throughout this process is like, I get it now.
Yeah.
There is no other. There is no other.
Right.
And when we continue to use divisive language, and not both, because that's very didactic, but all sides can do this. When we continue to use divisive language, we will still fail to meet in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do I think everybody is deserving of empathy? Yes, I actually do. Now, boots on the ground, is that easy? No, that is not easy, because I do come to this work, especially from an angle that says, if one group or many groups is being kind of pushed down by other groups, I want to be there as an ally for those on the fringes and on the outskirts, and for those that need help. And I find a very clear biblical imperative there, personally. I do. So it is very hard to not come to these conversations with an agenda, because I think there is. My agenda just happens to be that we all deserve empathy. And if we can approach a common table with a common goal, then it's something that we can achieve. It is the energy. It is the energy that makes everything work. I mean, when you look at the way that we talk about collaboration or politics or any kind of worthwhile effort, it is the ability to work together and to see a common goal from each other's perspective that will get us over the finish line. I mean, I'm not very certain about very many things these days, but of that, I'm pretty darn certain.
Yeah. One of the things I feel like I hear, or I think that I hear maybe as people like to come with pretty extreme examples to try and poke holes in maybe something like empathy, like, well, you can have empathy for some people, but certain people have empathy for. And in some cases, maybe I'm a little more sympathetic. I feel like white supremacists, I'm a little more hesitant. Like, do we need to be empathetic to them, or we really need to be taking a stand against people like that, and we shouldn't feel bad for them or anything like that, right? I think one thing that might be helpful, I was just listening to a talk by Jamila Jamil. I've really started binging The Good Place.
Yeah.
And she was actually mentioned in another episode because she has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which I did an episode with a friend of mine who has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And she was talking about this need, I think, for empathy for men, and understanding that the things that cause toxic masculinity and some of the problematic behaviors that Me Too movement and other things are naming and shaming, maybe rightly so in some ways, that part of it is that boys learn these things from very early. You and I can probably attest that we learned things about our emotions and things like that. So for example, taking a very maybe hard example to hear, is like rape, for example.
Yeah.
So there's trauma for the victim, and that needs to be, a huge part of how we as a society approach that act and that behavior, is responding to the trauma of the victims, believing them, and but helping perpetrators to learn how to be better people, better men,
right,
has to involve empathy. And I think in some ways it's hard for us to wrap our minds around because we're so punitive.
Yes.
And it feels I think I get nervous. I'm nervous right now saying this, Michael. I'm scared because I know that somebody is going to say, well, Lucas is kind of taking it easy on rapists, or he's kind of not taking it seriously, or why isn't he taking the sides of victims? And that's why I'm trying to be careful, because I don't want to say that. But I do want to say, if we want to help people who have problems like that, who are in some way able to dehumanize someone else enough to do that kind of violence, and there are many kinds of violence people can do, abusive, gaslighting, so many different ways that we can abuse each other. Empathy means those people have reasons why they do it, unmet needs, like we said before.
Right.
Can we imagine what those unmet needs are? For me, you call empathy a superpower.
Yeah.
To me, that's where I see it come to light as a superpower, because it's a little more than I think I'm capable of. I don't know if
that's fair. Sense. That's fair. You know what? I'm going to throw out a cliche that I'm sure many people have heard, and that's okay. Cliches are cliches because there's a certain element of truth in them. Hurt people hurt people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that should be like a mantra, honestly. We should wake up in the morning, be grateful, show some gratitude. Science has shown that gratitude actually rewires our brain for a positive, for the positive. So we should wake up in the morning and think grateful thoughts. And we should also walk around and realize that hurt people hurt people. We are hurt. We are injured. We are scarred in ways that we don't talk about. That's where the shame comes in.
Yeah.
And when we have that shame, we are more likely to kind of to be punitive for other people, because it kind of it touches a nerve, it touches a scar that we have, and so we get extreme reactions when we start talking about the hard things, like rape. You know, so if we were to actually go throughout our day and look at the people that we interact with and say, one, the only thing that I know it sounds counterintuitive, but we know that it's true, is that you do not get love unless you give it away. It's this perpetuating thing. So you've got that going out into the people and the universe around you. And you also realize that not only am I a hurt person, but everybody around me has something that has injured them. And we all react different ways to that. The other thing that I would say is that we absolutely have a mental health crisis in not just this country, but I'm sure globally. We have a crisis of stigma for people that have challenges with depression and anger, and where they, even though I feel like we've been talking about it so much lately, but it is still to the point where people have that shame about talking about it and about asking for help. And when we lift that veil, when we lift that cloud and let people, talk about it kind of in the light rather than in the shadow of their shame, so much more health and wellness is going to come from it. Vulnerability meets vulnerability. When you are vulnerable with me by asking a question like that, I'm going to be vulnerable with you. And the hardest thing about showing our vulnerabilities is being courageous enough to continually show up and do it again and again, even though we know that it's risky, even though we know we could get injured. But showing those vulnerabilities and showing that bravery and courage through that elevates everybody's within shouting distance, right? It elevates everybody's ability to talk about the hard things. And once we start those conversations, I think it becomes a lot easier to talk to the people that we, before now would probably have been very punitive towards. When you lift your eyes and open your eyes to the hurt of people around you, you're more willing to be gracious. You're more willing to show empathy. And especially if we lift that out of the internet and put it in practice with the people around us.
Yeah. You said earlier that one definition or way of thinking about what empathy is that it's sitting with discomfort, whether that's anguish or other emotions that we have. And I really like that definition. It's helpful to think of encounters that we have that are uncomfortable with people, for whatever reason. There's lots of different reasons why things are awkward. And how we all have different ways to avoid those moments, where we maybe make jokes to kind of change the subject, or some people just avoid. I tend to actually be more like I tackle things head on.
Yeah.
So I kind of dominate, and then that way I'm kind of in control, and I don't have to deal with the discomfort as much, because I can kind of control the conversation or something like that, right? And I don't sit and think about, what is really happening with this other person that makes me want to run away, makes me want to fix it or steer the conversation a different way, or do something to make it go away. So that idea of just sitting with it, I think, sitting with our own feelings, we're so out of touch with even our own reactions day to day to what's happening,
yeah
and why we're feeling that way.
I think there's a real stigma, especially with men, because of the gendered conversation around feelings, right? When I was a kid, I was told that I was too sensitive. When I was a little boy, I was told that, I mean, I would cry on, at the drop of a hat. And I was made fun of for it.
Mm-hmm.
And not saying little girls don't get made fun of for crying. That probably happens too. But from a very early age, we have this strange conversation around feelings and emotions and gender.
Yeah.
To the point where when you start talking about more empathetic things, most people would assume that that a woman or somebody with more feminine kind of instincts is going to kind of lead that charge. And my challenge there is that while I think that the conversation around who does what or who does what better, or who's a better engineer versus who's a better teacher, while there might be some basis of truth in that, the challenge is to strip the language away from this conversation around connection. Because I think for some reason it's become so much easier for us to have those conversations, in regards to like little boys and little girls. But I think the best way forward really is to be able to just have better conversations with our young people about their emotions. I have a 7-year-old daughter. And when she's having issues, I will, and she's going through big emotions, we'll sit down and we'll say, okay, what are you feeling? Why are you feeling it? Can you name it? Do you know the why? What else is going on? I mean, all the things that you would hope somebody would do for you, but we don't. We don't. And, I get it. Sometimes when people are going through, especially very low emotional times, a lot of people say, well, they'll work through it, and they kind of keep them at arm's length. And, well, I don't know. I guess that might be true sometimes, but 99.9% of the time, I'm going to be the guy that says, no, lean in. We need some curiosity there. And there's nothing, nothing worse than feeling isolated when you're in that moment, as the person kind of going through that downtime.
Right.
More connection is never going to hurt anybody.
Yeah. No, I can imagine. Sometimes I'm telling my wife, like, I need some, or my kids, because they seem to be everywhere. We had 3 of them, and they've really taken over. And so sometimes I say, like, I need some space. Like I'm feeling a little bit impatient or something along those lines. But it doesn't mean I don't want connection. I think people can want a little bit of space, but that I still want them to want to be around me, to want to connect with me, and all of that sort of stuff. So
see, and what I don't want to confuse, because I talk, especially lately, I feel like I've been talking about this a lot with folks, and in my podcast. I'm not talking about healthy boundaries.
Yeah, right.
Healthy boundaries are so incredibly important.
I might have to have you back on just to have like a whole episode about boundaries, because I feel like that's a thing people talk a lot about without having very good understanding. And maybe I don't have a very good understanding either.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah, it's just one of those things. And yeah, we could definitely unpack that at a different time, but it's, boundaries are not walls. Boundaries to me are kind of like, I said this the other day, it's kind of like having 2 plants side by side. If they might be different, they might flower different, they might grow different. One might have deeper roots, one might have greener leaves. They each might have their own way to be a plant. They can coexist, they can do and look beautiful together, and they can come from the same soil, and they can use the same sunlight. But oftentimes you have to have kind of a clear kind of area for each of them in order to grow in their own way.
Right.
And I think if we looked at our relationships a little bit more like that, it would be so helpful, and
Yeah.
especially in romantic and marriage relationships, where, I mean, we don't have to have all the same hobbies. We don't have to be doing the same thing all the time. You be the best you, and I will be the best me, and that means when we're together, we're the best we.
Yeah.
And it's hard to do that, though, sometimes, especially with people where their relationships might, I think you said the word codependent earlier. There's a little bit more unhealthy, like, codependent relationships that we see played out, right?
Yeah.
Where we do need our space. We do need our time. It's just in those moments of like trauma and despair where it's like, okay, hold on, let's do this thing together rather than apart.
Yeah. When you were talking earlier about emotions and gender, I was reminded of a meme that I saw on Facebook that really, I had never thought about this way, but the way that we gender emotions or talk about emotions, that we usually say women are more emotional, right? And that men are out of touch with their emotions. And this meme said, what was it? It was something about that. Only someone who's never had an angry dad completely control the mood in the house would believe that women are more emotional.
Right.
And just kind of pointing out, like, we talk about it that way, I think, for certain reasons about how we think about women and that they're less rational, for example. But the truth is, men, partly because we're not taught how to manage our emotions, we are much harsher with our emotions. I think we use them as a weapon sometimes.
Yes.
And women often have to be in control of their emotions much more from early on, right? Because in order to get ahead, they sort of have to be able to take more than others, and they're having to control their emotions, where men get sort of these, they're not good outlets, but, like, I don't know, football or boxing or wrestling or whatever, we get these athletic ways to, like, get our anger out. It's not healthier, but at least we have an outlet, whereas women often probably don't have outlets where it's okay.
No, I think you're right. It's just such an unfortunate situation that we find ourselves in, because I think many men don't know how to handle righteously angry women. And I'm for darn sure know that most men don't know how to handle their emotions themselves. I mean, we're seeing this played out right now. I mean, we absolutely are seeing this played out. And the thing is that we have our emotions. Our emotions exist. We can observe our emotions in a way that allows us to honor them. I mean, rage when you need to rage, we can honor them. And then if we can, within community, whether it's family or friends or church or whatever environment you find yourselves in, you can honor your emotions and still not let them drive the bus. We need to, while we need to allow ourselves to have that very gut reaction, we also need to be able to go into that second phase of taking time to be curious about somebody else's experience.
And it seems like that's where to kind of come back around to empathy. That's where we can begin to have empathy, when we practice that sort of second round. Okay, I had an emotion. Now how do I kind of handle it? And then understanding my reaction versus blaming someone else for what just happened. And then being able to go, okay, well, what's going on with them? I wonder, and being curious, like you're saying. Yeah, that's good.
I've found, and I know we'll probably wrap up here in a second, but I know I talked a lot about, or not a lot, but a little bit about religion, my religious background, being Baptist. In the last couple years, I lean more towards Buddhism. Now, Buddhism isn't a religion. Nobody who is Buddhist thinks that Buddha is God, but that's neither here nor there. I'm just saying that it's not really a substitute. But the thing that I have found so helpful in learning a little bit more about kind of the Buddhist way of life is this idea of detachment. And detachment is not being aloof or not caring. Detachment is detachment from outcome or detachment from expectations. It's the ability to have emotions and observe them and still be able to dive in curiosity and in empathy with the people around us. It's the ability to say, yes, I'm angry and I'm going to honor that, but I'm also going to, set that aside and be able to calmly move forward in relationship with this person. And that's why I keep coming back to this idea of empathy, just being this connection and this energy that can, really generate deep relationships. And it connects everything. And I mean, if you want to say it's synonymous with love, great. But I think that puts a little bit too much affect into it. It's not necessarily love. It's just the idea that we are all connected. And if we honor that, and if we really focus in on that connection, then there's so much more of a fruitful life that we will find for ourselves and for our community if we do that.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, I guess now maybe I can give you the nickname, the Baptist Buddhist. I don't know if that would be a good nickname for you. You can take that. You can use it. That's free. From me to you.
I don't know how Baptist I am anymore, to be honest. I'm not sure how Baptist.
It's pretty catchy though. I mean,
right.
It does kind of throw you off balance a little bit. The Baptist Buddhist, what the heck's that guy about?
Maybe I just need to hold on to that. That's branding opportunity right there.
There you go. Baptists are one of the most obese denominations in the U.S. I know. So maybe there's something there where you kind of have the Baptist Buddhist, the little, kind of pudgy Buddha figure. I don't know. We'll have to keep workshopping this and see if we can come up with a logo for this.
A Buddha with a casserole dish. Yeah, there you go.
There you go.
That's some good Baptist humor right there.
Man, this has been really great, and I just feel like we've covered some really good territory, and there seems like so much more that we could really talk about. But I do want to wrap up and talk about our three things: something that we learned in our conversation, or that we were reminded of; something that we can do, an action step; and then something we can share, a resource or a recommendation. And I will go first. Something that I learned and wasn't how I kind of thought about empathy before, that was really helpful to me, was thinking about it not as something that we do, but that it's something that's inherent. It's something that we are wired with. And so in some ways it's something we need to try and get back to. That's something essential about our physiology, our brains and mirror neurons and stuff. I'm such a doer, and I like projects. I like to fix things and work on things, including myself, and so I always like having something to do. And it's important to remember sometimes that it's not always about doing something. Sometimes it's just about like remembering and kind of going back to, oh, this is who I am, and how I was made and how we are meant to function. So that was I really, really found that helpful. Something that we can do, I liked your definition, again, of empathy as sitting with discomfort. So I want to recommend to people just to pay attention during your day and notice when you're uncomfortable. And you don't have to fix it. You don't have to make it go away, but just pay attention. Like, where do you feel it in your body? Like you were saying with your daughter, naming your emotions, maybe getting curious about it and finding, like doing a little anthropology on yourself, where you're trying to understand what is really happening? Why am I feeling this way? And sit with it. And don't try to sweep it under the rug quite so fast. If we could all do that, I think we'll all be making a lot of progress.
Yeah.
And something I want to share that I've been reading about, I feel like I've heard several different podcasts about this. It keeps coming up, and it's very, very closely related to what we're talking about, and that's self-compassion. I started reading a book by Dr. Kristen Neff. I think she was on that Dax Shepard podcast.
Oh yeah,
Armchair Expert.
Yes.
And I just loved what she was talking about self-compassion. Maybe it was another podcast. I'm going to have to figure out where I listened to this so I can include it in the show notes. But I checked out her website and I got her book. And I've been reading that. Her website has a ton of free resources, guided meditations you can download, and like exercises you can do. The basic idea of self-compassion is thinking about how we would treat strangers or our best friends even, and then trying to treat ourselves the way that we want others to treat us, and that
Right.
we would treat people who we love that we're having a really difficult time, for example. And I know for myself, I have a very strong inner critic, and that voice is constantly judging me and saying harsh things, and I'm so used to it, I don't even notice, right?
Right.
And so practicing self-compassion, I think, also helps us have more compassion for others and the ability to have empathy where we tend to judge or be critical. I know for myself, I tend to be very critical of other people, mostly because I'm very critical and harsh towards myself. So that's something I'm working on and something I recommend, and I'll put links to her stuff and her book in the show notes.
That's great.
Michael, 3 things.
Yeah. So in preparation for our conversation, I listened to your nonviolent communication episode.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that we talked a little bit more about it today, because I think there's a lot of connections there. And I know I kind of intimated earlier that, I find it hard not to find connections to empathy anywhere.
Sure.
I think that they're everywhere, but I think that was so prescient. It was so purposeful, and it really kind of made me think about not just internalizing what this idea of empathy means, but the fact that we can practice it, and especially with our kids. We talked a number of times over the conversation about our families. You have 3, and when I have everybody in my house, I have 5 kids. So what we do and how we mirror our relationships and how we mirror us handling our own emotions and act empathetically is the first step in teaching our kids like nonviolent communication, teaching our kids empathy. So that was really helpful. Something we can do. I might have to echo a little bit of what you said. I think I will keep that through line, and whether it's with your family or with your roommate or with coworkers or whomever you find is your kind of inner core group, take some time to listen to each other. Don't talk at each other. Take some time to find an opportunity to sit with people and not feel like you have to fix. That's so hard to do sometimes. And again, we talked about the whole gendered thing, and how many times were we told as guys, your wife or your girlfriend doesn't want you to fix anything, she just wants you to listen to them. Well, you know what, guys need that too, and we need to encourage that conversation. That we're not there to fix each other. We're just there to like live with each other, basically, and love on each other. Something that we can share. A couple things. One, and you might be one of the, if you're not one of the, I think close to 8 million or maybe it's more, I don't know, I should look at it before I say the number, but basically, if you have not looked or watched the TED Talk from Brené Brown on vulnerability and shame, run, don't walk to your nearest Google and search for it. It is, I mean, it's a TED Talk. It's literally like 15 minutes long. It doesn't take a lot of investment of time, and it is so eye-opening. And it just brings this conversation into, she's just so good with kind of universal language and just making it understandable for everyone. This idea of connection is not going to go away. It's going to stay. And the more that we kind of dig into it and dive into it, I think will be helpful.
Great. Hey, thank you so much. Tell people where they can find your podcast and listen to Empathy And.
Sure. Yeah. If you can go to empathyand.com. So I do have a website. It's just empathyand.com. And you go to the podcast episodes, you can get to listen to the episodes. I'm pretty proud of it. It's kind of sciencey, it's kind of spiritual. It lands kind of in the middle of those two things, and that's firmly where I feel comfortable in talking about it. So yeah, you can find everything else from there. That we've got a Facebook group if you want to come join. But you can find the links for it at the website at empathyand.com. And I really appreciate you reaching out, Lucas. This was fun. I hope we get a chance to do it again.
Yeah, fantastic, Michael. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us today on We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land. If you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Help us spread the word by sharing it on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @WDTAT Podcast. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can support the podcast by visiting our website at wdtatpodcast.com and clicking on support. You can make a one-time donation or consider becoming a monthly supporter through Patreon. You'll receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits. Thanks for your support. We would love to hear from you. Leave us a voicemail by going to our website and clicking Send Voicemail. Your voicemail could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at wdtatpodcast@gmail.com. Many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. A final thought from Brené Brown. The willingness to show up changes us. It makes us a little braver each time. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?